case. Yeah.
And good afternoon. I wonder if I could call order and ask for everyone to turn off their cell phone. I'm Tom Sinkin, Vice President for External Affairs at the Daniel Morgan Graduate School. Welcome. This should be a fascinating event. Daniel Morgan has partnered with NBR for the past couple of years in support of this project, which we think is extremely timely and worthwhile. It's been terrific to work with the NBR team, and I know that our faculty, and particularly our students, have gotten a great deal out of the project, of which you will be hearing, about which you'll be hearing, and about which you'll be reading in a terrific monograph, which I think you should all have copies of, and if not, they're on the table outside. I think that particular thanks need to go to Nadezhda Rolland and the fabulous job that she did curating and editing, and also, of course, Roy Camphausen, my friend, who has recently stepped up, and rightfully so, to lead NBR, and for whom I have nothing but the highest degree of respect. And I'd like to turn to him now, and by way of that brief introduction, and thank you all for being here, and thank you, Roy, for hosting it.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you. The report is a culmination of many months of work from many talented scholars, several of whom are here today. In the collection of their 7 essays, the authors present their assessments of the implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative for the People's Liberation Army and other Chinese security actors. It outlines, the report does, how the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative in the last 6 years coincides with the expansion of broader Chinese national interests overseas, as well as China's shifting military strategy, which calls for China to become a global leader by mid-century. Collectively, the authors offer an examination of China's policy options as Beijing works to secure its national interests along the BRI routes, as well as the impact to the United States' ability to shape future regional security developments as a consequence of Belt and Road initiatives. The report covers a variety of topics, including China's 3 models for protecting its overseas interests, as well as the development of the digital Silk Road and Space Information Corridor, the potential for a Pla Expeditionary Force and dual-use facilities, Beijing's power projection into Central Asia, and the emerging role of private security companies in securing Belt and Road Initiative projects, among other topical themes. Common to all these 7 essays is the notion that as China expands its overseas interests, the need for military and security protection must necessarily follow. I must thank, of course, my colleague, Nadezhda Rolland, as Tom mentioned, for her leadership on this special report. Nadege remains at the forefront of the scholarship of Chinese foreign and defense policy, especially, but not limited to, her work on the Belt and Road. There's a new project coming out in some months that looks at China's vision for itself in the world, and that will definitely be something you'll want to read when Nadege finishes and we publish it. We're lucky to have her expertise at NBR at this critical time, especially as Nadege writes in the special report when the U.S. government is beginning to recognize the far-reaching implications of China's expanding security frontier. This work could not be completed as well, however, without the work of senior project managers Brian Franchell and Melissa Newcomb. Melissa's here, whose efforts are reflected in the quality of the scholarship that's presented. So of course, they're led by NBR's Vice President for Research, Ali Sawinski, and Ali will moderate the panel of specialists that takes place after we hear our keynote remarks. But please join me in thanking our colleagues for putting together this great publication. It's also my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for today's event, Mr. Chad Sbragia, who serves as the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. As many of you know, in this capacity, Nadezhda Sbragia advises the senior leadership of DoD on all policy matters related to China, including influencing defense strategies, plans, and bilateral security relations. We'll talk more about that after his presentation. Prior to his work at OSD, Chad was the director of China Research Group for the United States Marine Corps, the deputy director of the China Strategic Focus Group at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and the country director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the J5 Strategic Planning and Policy Directorate. He also is a retired United States Marine officer. His distinguished military career in the Marine Corps began in 1985. He served as a combat engineer, an infantry officer, and a China Foreign Area officer, and he led Marines deployed across the Middle East, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific. Nadezhda Sbragia also held assignments as a U.S. Marine attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, where he steered U.S.-China military relations and negotiated bilateral agreements on the recovery of U.S. personnel in Asia, among other agreements. Chad is a great old friend, and he comes to this job uniquely qualified, and at a time when government officials, policymakers, and academics have begun to speak of a new normal in U.S.-China relations. Indeed, officials and scholars increasingly question the compatibility of the United States Indo-Pacific strategy juxtaposed with China's Belt and Road Initiative. And so as this debate plays out in the public square, it's our privilege and honor to host Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Chad Sbragia as today's keynote speaker to share his perspectives on these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Nadezhda Sbragia. After Chad finishes his prepared remarks, he's agreed to take some questions. I'll moderate for that, and we have, I think, a good amount of time to be able to answer your questions. Thank you, Chad.
Yes, thank you. Roy, thank you. That was very humbling. And I'll try to maximize the time for questions and answers, but certainly my first opening has to be to you, Roy, and to the distinguished guests here, and certainly the authors, and providing a thanks for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. Roy knows that our team is completely invested in deepening research and understanding of these issues, and it's a great pleasure to be here to put a little bit of wind in the sails to do so. Certainly China's approach to securing its Belt and Road Initiative, or the One Belt, One Road investments, is exactly the type of issue that we should be exploring, frankly, because of the unique challenges it presents. It's something that we concentrate on every single day in our new office. I enthusiastically endorse the research in this vital issue, and it really is at the center of what we do from day to day for our team and more broadly across the department and certainly the interagency. I have to applaud, and I've mentioned this to some of them already, the authors for this report. Securing the BRI, for the original research, and frankly for contributing to a deeper understanding of where China is going to go and how it's trying to get there. I find the research uses authoritative sources. It's sophisticated in every measure. I got to tell you, it's just impressive, and we read a lot. And this is going to really contribute to us, but more importantly, we are going to advocate that it contributes to everybody's deepening and better perspective on China. I think that you have asked, and you really help answer a lot of questions that we face every day in the Defense Department. What the Defense Department has prioritized, which is China. For example, you've asked very good questions on China's military engagement as it goes out and about. What is that going to look like? How does it support BRI objectives? What are the legal and legislative changes that China requires? What do those look like? Those are questions that are not asked very often. And I got to tell you, as somebody who gets up and reads Chinese every single morning and watching the debate on the legal requirements and the changes, particularly in the previous National People's Congress and in the last session, watching them discuss that and what that means to them is an important contribution to how this unfolds over a period of time. What does China's expeditionary forces look like? How do they want to project power? What are the implications of that? Those are fantastic questions, and I love the research in the findings here. What are the implications of the integrated Chinese approach? What does that mean, particularly the chapter on dual use and how they integrate across all organs of Chinese power in ways that in the past we would often ridicule China for not having the capacity to do? And then certainly is, what are the other aspects that are unique to China's security approaches, their forces, their cooperation, and what will China do and how they will pursue it, and what is that, in what way is that unique? What I do know is that this report helps contribute to that. It's clear that the authors are contributing really in a large sense a caution that China's approach really won't necessarily mirror ours precisely, and that you have to understand why China's doing it and the way that they're doing it and the places where they might have success or shortfalls. To that end, I don't know how much I can contribute to the discussion other than to say is that this will be an important work for us to help focus on our own approach, better understanding China's strategic approach, and how the way that we'll work across our whole of government as we compete. As the authors note clearly, China's leaders, and to that end, I'll touch a little bit on what I can add on some of the strategy pieces, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing and how this report reflects the pressures of decisions and approaches for us internally. Certainly, as the authors note clearly, the Chinese leaders believe that they can and must contend for global leadership, certainly based most authoritatively from the new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics, heralded at the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of China in October of 2017. I think that, in fact, that's in the first chapter, or the foreword. Beyond having the ability and expertise to exert its influence on a global scale, great power status includes access to resources, a developed economy, and protection of perceived rights and interests. Many of these are main drivers of the BRI, as is their overarching national development and security strategies. I certainly can reinforce that this work helps amplify a better understanding of that. I think for us, we've had opportunities to talk to the PLA directly, our counterparts, and ask them the very same questions. And frankly, it's not an area that they've quite figured out in great depth. It is clear from their perspective is that they do aspire to prepare informationized capable forces capable of fighting informationized or even intelligentized approaches to warfighting across the globe, and it'll be mapped in large part to where the BRI is most heavily concentrated. There's an interesting term that we found when we read the Chinese, where they talk about, and one of their areas for this increased global PLA outreach, best identified in their latest defense white paper published in, I think, June or July of this year. But some of the precursors to that discussion talked about having the capacity for a strategic dagger. And you listen to some of their commanders talk about being able to respond to and have this capacity to provide Xi Jinping with this strategic dagger, this force capable of compelling at distance. And certainly those outlines of what that requirement is aligned with a lot of the BRI outreach and approaches for the PLA. I mentioned the legal changes as well at the National People's Congress and the subsequent sessions, but those are important too because it's not just a reflection about how they actually go about the processes of taking their force, which is generally continentally focused, increasingly maritime focused, but now has a mandate to go out and about. And those legal changes are interesting from several aspects. One is that there's actually a legal requirement and rule sets and restrictions and constrictions on what the PLA does. They can't just go because it's a fiat of Xi Jinping. but in terms of a normative governance structure and system that the Chinese continue to mature. And how they do that, how they approach that, and how they interact with that is important. I think that gives us a lot of clues, certainly within DoD and across the interagency, about different ways that we can that we will have to compete with the Chinese. Certainly, it adds a different level and increasing complexity, not only to our own U.S. policy directly with the Chinese themselves, the PLA in particular, but also with our other allies and partners globally. We struggle with that every single day about what does our outreach look like? What are the bounds and restrictions? These are new things for us, things that we haven't had to face in the past. Is what do we talk to about allies and partners globally about what China's doing, what the implications are? You have to have an argument here. The Chinese are certainly developing one. In fact, if I recall correctly, this week in Chusher, there was an article advocating for a Chinese discourse system, one of the outcomes from the summer of 2018's reformation of Chinese foreign policy. And that was actually a question I've asked of the PLA themselves of if there is a discourse system that you're trying to advocate, a narrative to explain the rationale behind their revisions to the international system, is there a corresponding military discourse system? And in fact, there is. And they're struggling with it. Ironically, what they said is we have a difficulty because the United States is so dominant we can't get our voice heard, which I took for some comfort, frankly. But the truth is that's kind of the nature of the competition. It's about new areas and new ways and new thinking and new approaches that drive us to contend in ways that we just simply haven't had to face in the past. We're certainly concerned that there's critical sectors that could be vulnerable to China, though. In so many different and new ways. Infrastructure developments and what that means for us, technology exports and controls, and diplomatic engagements that shape the different approaches that we have in a manner that we just have had we're still struggling to kind of contend with. And thankfully, I think that the PLA are as well. We talked to them, we hosted the Office of International Military Cooperation, previously known as the Ministry of National Defense for Foreign Affairs. When we talked to our counterparts, they were gracious and came out and sat down with us and had a long discussion about China's defense white paper, and I think that they were pretty frank. One of the issues that we talked about is, what does this look like? You say you want to go out and about, you want to be bigger on the global stage, what is this going to look like? And they simply just don't have the answers yet, but they're figuring it out, just like we are, I think. What is clear is that they are shooting for the stars and making progress when they go out and about. It's not simply to do lower level non-war type activities, but to do what any military would do, is to have a capacity to prevail in conflict on a global scale at the end of the day, and to do it with some of the most sophisticated approaches for warfighting that we've seen. It's a reminder that certainly, though, and particularly from the authors, is that we shouldn't assess China's progress simply by the rubrics of past processes or thinking, but by where China intends to go out in the future and what that means for all of us. So our response within DoD is really guided by the National Defense Strategy, which identifies great power competition as our principal priority. Increasing lethality and strengthening alliances and partnerships are long-term undertakings for this competition with China, and I'm glad to be leading the new office, as Roy mentioned, dedicated to assisting this area, and we're bringing on a tremendous quiver of folks from multidiscipline backgrounds and specialties to help to weigh in on this. Critically, the National Defense Strategy also states that the Defense Department will support interagency approaches and work by, with, and through our allies and partners. This is something one of my colleagues that's here today, Maya, is working on furiously, and actually is extending my workday is now about 22 hours long, I think, and mostly because of Maya, I believe. So. The most important takeaway from our discussions is this, though, is that we need diplomatic, informational, economic, and security efforts to respond to China's Belt and Road activities, and they have to be integrated in ways that we just in the past haven't done as well as we should. DoD certainly supports a whole government response in really three kind of critical ways. First, we provide assessments to our interagency counterparts to identify which of China's BRI or OBOR investments have national security implications. Those are things that we just have never had to touch on as much as we do now. Second, we have to work to deepen security partnerships and underwrite stability, enabling economic and diplomatic tools to succeed. We don't seek to counter China dollar for dollar necessarily, but to play to our strengths and understand what those strengths are. Certainly by promoting shared principles, developing high standard alternatives for acute needs, and working with our allies and partners on developing best practices and understanding what implications and risks are to them. Finally, we share best practices with other countries for engaging China's military. As China goes out and about, they will start engaging more, and we have to make sure that we understand what the implications of that may be. We encourage carefully scoped defense engagements, hard discussions on the risks of China's military presence, national security-based investment screening, and risk-based security frameworks for issues such as 5G. This helps build a long-term principles-based approach to address risks and has really elevated kind of our thinking within the department, particularly for China, into a much more strategic realm, I think, than it has been in the past. In conclusion, the unfolding of long-term strategic competition with China is the defining challenge of our generation. Certainly my own perspective, but what the direction from the department is. And it will likely remain so. We remain committed to our vision for a free and open order, which is affirmative and inclusive of all countries, to include China, as we've told them. That supports common enduring principles. The United States will continue to work closely with like-minded allies and partners, international organizations, regional institutions, and others to ensure that the rules-based international order, not coercion or force, dictates the future. With that, we could take some questions.
You want to have a seat?
Yes, please, thanks.
I think, Charles, we're mic'd. Can we go to our lapel mics and I'll moderate questions? And Chad, let me ask the first. You alluded to the restructuring in OSD. Talk a little bit more about what it looks like and how you're staffed and what your missions are.
Yeah, I got to tell you, you so infrequently get an opportunity for your leadership to say, hey, we have this challenge, it's a priority, and to say, rally your experts that you have on hand and talk about designing what you would need for this challenge. And so we've actually had great latitude to come up with an approach, and I think what you've seen is it's an expansion of a trend that's been ongoing for a few years, which is to understand that China is not just the bilateral relationship that we have in kind of managing that, the defense contacts and exchange program that we've had for decades that Roy is a stakeholder in, but to start to delve into deeper areas such as strategic design. What does long-term competition look like? What does that mean for us? Global outreach. How do we shape and inform and rally and listen to allies and partners on a global scale? What are the high-tech issues that now challenge us? Technology controls like CFIUS management, and how does policy weigh into that? And so essentially in each four of those main buckets, we have teams that are going to deepen their expertise, bring on all kinds of different lenses to help look at those challenges. And a common thread that's running through there that we've had a struggle with in the past is somebody that can manage the narrative that we create. What are our talking points? How do you align those things? And how do you share them not just across the Defense Department, but also across the interagency so that they're more targeted, often tailored to the specific audience that we're talking to. So the expansion of the team is it's going to just over double, almost triple in size. But I will close with one point, which is we're going to have these kind of cells of excellence working on these topical issues, but the overarching, I think, theme that we have, which is really is a frank and honest conclusion, is that there's no team big enough that could take on this challenge. It's going to be much more about networking into other groups and partners, some of them more non-traditional FFRDCs and think tanks, other scholars and experts that you can tap into and bring into the fold and help inform the entire process. That's probably going to be the most important part.
So your boss is Assistant Secretary of Defense Randy Shriver. Yeah. You have China, and then who are your peers in this new structure?
In this new structure, I think our peers, to be safe, is every other DASD that's in OSD policy is a peer, because we touch on every single one of them. There's not an issue we do in terms of the regional outreaches that we have, any of the functional issues. There's not an area that China doesn't touch, to include the Joint Staff, all the combatant commands, and certainly all the allies and partners that we have. So that's really my peers. Well, that sounds like a horrible answer, but it's absolutely true. So that's why we're busy. I mean, we're busy. So.
We're so glad you're in this job. We have about 10 minutes. We'd love to take your questions. And please just stand, identify yourself, ask your question, and Jonathan, let's start with you. I guess there's a mic. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Jonathan Ward, author of China's Vision of Victory. So I wanted to ask you more about China, about the strategic dagger. I mean, what are 3 or 4 things we should know about that? I mean, what's it made of? What's its geographical range, time frame, et cetera? Thanks.
You know, that's an interesting question, because we've asked the Chinese about that. There's a couple good writings on that. The one that comes to mind most specifically is, you know, the Chinese have just expanded their Marine Corps quite a bit. I think upwards of 6, 7, 8 brigades, which is a pretty large-sized force. And they've assigned a new commander to that brigade, former Army officer, Kong Jun, I believe is his name.
Really?
Kong Fuzi the Kong, yeah, Kong Jun. And he talks about it. He penned a couple of articles right after he was assigned to that task, and he mentions that in there, but in a way that parallels other references to that, which is being able to provide a service, frankly, that the PLA has been long asked for, starting back with the Jiang Zemin era, which is, I need to be able to go out and have the PLA influence things at distance, and the Chinese just frankly haven't had that capacity. So, in the near term, when we hosted the Chinese PLA delegation here recently, we asked them about that. Frankly, you talk very specifically about having a new requirement. It's one of their new tasks that they have for their military, is to go out and about, have more influence, and have a greater status and involvement in the global system. And we asked them, what does that look like? And what's the shape of this? What's the nature of this? And to include, how do you command and control this? This is not an easy thing. And their answer was, well, we're not sure yet. We're working on it. And I said, well, good, take your time. Yeah, take your time.
But it sounds conceptually distinct from the old assassin's mace notion, which, I mean, the way you've described it sounds more force structure answer than a capability.
I don't even think that the Chinese necessarily assign kind of a nefarious, it sounds threatening, strategic dagger. I think with it, it's more of a euphemism for a capability set that they just simply have not had in the past. And it's a requirement about where they're at, particularly in light of the change of the principal contradiction from the 19th Party Congress, which is we now at a position where we have to influence the global environment in a greater extent. And the PLA is a simple element to do so that hasn't in the past.
Sir.
Thank you so much. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. 2 questions. First one, is your position unprecedented in Pentagon? Did Pentagon set up a similar position before, especially for one country, like for Soviet Union, something like that? And second, last month in Shanshan Forum, you said that Pentagon has no decoupling policy toward China. I know many experts in Washington or Beijing doubt that argument. So could you please give us some examples or some certain policy to show that Pentagon is still cooperating with China or engaging with China rather than decoupling with China? Thank you.
So on the first question, I don't know how far back in history this is, but I don't know if I have the recollection all the way back to the Soviet Union days, but certainly in the contemporary era, China has always been accounted for in some measure by multiple offices. But the nature of the workload is they're going to carve it out so that we can provide more concentration on it. It's a reflection of much larger trend lines within the Defense Department to include the prioritization of China issues. So for the Shangshan Forum,
you made some news.
Yeah, it was so interesting, and I was grateful that 2 days after I made those comments, the Vice President echoed the exact same comments. So that was actually fortuitous, but really true. The nature of the conversation that we were having at Shangshan, I was sitting on a panel just like this. In fact, almost exactly the same white chairs and white table, by the way. So that's interesting, right? is that the conversation was that the United States approach from think tanks and other scholars was that the United States approach was containment. We wanted to contain China. That was a large narrative. The senior Chinese leadership at the time, it kind of started off the conference with that narrative of essentially the United States is out to get China, and so the scholars kind of picked up on that rationale is that the United States wants to contain China, and the first step in containing China is to decouple from China. And the moderator was very good. He asked, does anybody on the panel want to challenge any conventional wisdom or thoughts? And then I said, well, that's one I have to contend with. I think my remarks, I'll paraphrase myself here, I think, is, I go to work every day, and we never have discussions about decoupling. That's not an official U.S. policy. It's certainly not a U.S. DoD policy. And I think on the face of it, it's frankly, I think as the ASD said, not only unbelievable, but probably unwise. I find it difficult to think about how you would pull out. I will give you a couple examples. There's areas of cooperation we have with China, the PLA in particular. So one of them is the one that Roy mentioned in the opening, which was we have a very robust and hopefully increasing cooperative effort with China on accounting for POWs and MIAs from World War II to now. And that takes effort and alignment. There's other security issues. We have lots of discussions with the PLA on a whole range of global security issues, from cyber and space to regional security issues that there's alignment and cooperation on. We wish we could do more. In fact, that's one of the aims of what we're doing. We have a team in Beijing this week working with the Chinese PLA on increasing the robust nature of the structure of our defense contacts and engagements. And I think that the Chinese, at least initially, have signed up to work very hard and sincerely towards that end. So we both have I think, agreement at the presidential level, as the Chinese would say, and certainly at the working level of having stability in the relationship. So,
Thank you. Please, just to the right of the gentleman. Yes. Yes.
Rita Chen with.
Can we, her and then you, okay? Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Chia Cheng with United News Group Taiwan. I have two questions. First one is, are you also in charge with the Taiwan issue, or are they, the China and Taiwan, are they now two separate issues in DoD? And second question is, Secretary of Defense Esper spoke with his Chinese counterpart last week. The Chinese statement said that they talk about Taiwan, but the U.S. statement didn't mention it. Can you give us a little bit more detail on what they discussed about Taiwan? Thank you.
Oh, those are great questions. First question is, no, I only do, our interactions are with the PLA. So Taiwan matters fall under one of my peers, DASD, Heino Klink. As for the Esper initiated a call, and conducted a call last week with one of what we consider actually to be one of his three counterparts. In this case, the Minister of Defense, General Wei Fenghe. During that, I believe that the readout from the Chinese side indicated that General Wei had raised the Taiwan in his discussion, and that's true, he did. And we provided feedback on that, but we just didn't put that in our outcomes of that.
Great, please.
Rita Chen with Radio Free Asia. You just mentioned that United States encouraged a cautious engagement with China. Could you give us some example? What does that mean? Cautious engagement with China. Thank you.
Closer engagement?
Cautious.
Oh, cautious engagement.
You've coined a new phrase.
Cautious engagement. Boy, did I? Well, let me try to strike that from the record if that's possible. So, yeah, there's no new phrase. I think that we're always, I think both sides certainly are increasingly understanding is that there's inherent risk as the powers accelerate their capacities, China's aspirations, where they want to go, what they now have the capacity to enforce or try to safeguard. And there's inherent risk in that. I think the Chinese side is fully aware that That's one of the main drivers. I think that when you hear the Chinese, they write often from Xi Jinping himself, talking about the need for the defense relationship to serve as a stabilizer in the relationship, is the Chinese phrase. We certainly agree that we want to have a stable relationship with China. Our national defense objectives include making sure that there's a predictable nature to this relationship, is that we prioritize a results-oriented outcome to the mill-to-mill engagements that we have, that they also prioritize keeping channels of communication open. One of the things that we've talked to our Chinese colleagues about recently is ensuring that those things can be stable over a period of time, is that they shouldn't reflect changes or signaling, frankly, signaling behavior is when they feel one side feels frustrated with the other, that they cancel events. The truth is that we've had numerous events this year canceled by the PLA side. You'll have to ask them the reason why, but what I can tell you is that there's key points of contact that we just haven't had chances to talk to the Chinese about because they keep canceling events. So that's not helpful, and I think that induces risk. So in that light is, we're trying to treat this with some sobriety and sophistication about how we approach these issues, and we certainly call upon our Chinese colleagues to do the same. So.
Thank you. Well, we want to keep on schedule, and so we probably have time for one more question. Sir, you've been very patient, so let's call on you, and then we'll move to the next phase in this.
Thank you. John Sidolides, Geopolitical Strategy at Trilogy Advisors. Could you please provide an update, sir, on the quadrilateral mutual defense structure being planned out with India, Japan, and Australia? Thank you.
Is that outside of your
that's
charter?
That's a little bit outside of where I focus on most of my day. I certainly work within the office that champions that. That's a critical and a key element of the overall Indo-Pacific strategy report that then Secretary Shanahan briefed at Shangri-La. And certainly the ASD, Randy Shriver, has talked about that quite often. We're in support of that. What we bring to the table is a reflection about how China thinks about that and what it means for China. When we were recently in China, they certainly asked us with great interest about what the meaning of that is, so, and I hope they do.
Do you see that as a containment strategy?
I'm not a spokesperson for, although I know both of the spokesperson for the PLA, Wu Qian, he's a good friend of mine. You'll have to ask how they view it. I don't know. I suspect that they don't like it based on how they've talked about it, but what they should listen to first is that our approach to the Indo-Pacific is free and open, and it includes China, and at every turn we've certainly tried to invite them and include them in any conversation. So.
Well, Chad, we're in your debt for spending so much time with us.
No, thank you. My pleasure.
For your comments. Thanks for taking questions, and please join me in thanking Chad.
Thank you.
Let's invite Ali up and her panel, and we'll move to the next phase.
got you now.
the right setup here. Like the men have the tie, so easy. Okay. Okay. I'll take those up. Are we not using them? I'm mic'd up now.
You ready?
All right. Is my mic on? Yeah. Good. All right. So thank you all for, again, I'll reiterate as Roy and Tom to thank you for coming here today. I am obviously not Nick Schifrin, as was advertised in some of our event announcements. Unfortunately, today we are running up head-to-head against the impeachment hearings. So that's drawn a few folks over to the Hill, including Nick. He had to go cover the hearings. So you get me instead, and I'm hoping that we have a great discussion here today. We have a great set of experts to talk about some of the issues that have already been highlighted that we have in the report, and they're also going to be able to take some questions after they give some presentations, field from you, anything that some of their presentations kind of bring to mind, and anything you have to ask. So with that, we're going to start with Nadege. Nadezhda Law, as Roy mentioned, was the PI, the principal investigator for this project. In the report, she has an introduction that really gives a great overview of the issues that are examined in the report. She's just kind of going to go over some of those. And you guys can all have the bio sheets here, but I'll give her brief bio. She's a senior fellow with NBR, where her research focuses mainly on China's foreign and defense policy and the changes in the regional dynamics across Eurasia resulting from the rise of China. She draws from 20 plus years of experience as a French government official, and also because of that has a significant interest in transatlantic cooperation on Asia affairs. So after Nadege talks, we'll turn it over to Mathieu, who authored the chapter in the report on kind of what are the possibilities for future China military operations in BRI countries, and what are the constraints that could prevent some of those operations. And he is the director of the Asia program at Institut Montaigne. Before joining the Institute, he was Senior Policy Fellow and Deputy Director of the Asia and China program at the European Council of Foreign Relations. Also the Senior Researcher and the Representative in Beijing of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and a Research Fellow at the Asia Center in Paris. So many previous affiliations for that. After Mathieu presents, then we'll turn to Kristen. Kristen Gunness authored the chapter in the report about how different PLA components are addressing the capability gap to develop a more flexible expeditionary force that's able to execute complex, larger, and lengthier deployments away from China's shores. And Kristen is the founder and CEO of Vantage Point Asia. She has over 20 years of experience advising senior leaders in government and the private sector on East Asia political, economic, and security affairs. Prior to that, she served for 4 years as the director of the Navy Asia Pacific Advisory Group at the Pentagon, where she advised the Chief of Naval Operations. And so with that, we'll go ahead and open it up and have Nadege give us some introductory remarks.
Well, thanks, Allie, and also thank you everyone for being with us today. I'm just going to give you a broad sense of what we wanted to achieve with this monograph. China is expanding and drastically so along the Silk Roads. For the last 6 years, really, its interests around the world are growing and expanding. And so, really, the key question behind this research was: so, how is the strategic community in Beijing think about securing and protecting citizens who are working on the infrastructure projects around the world? Over 2 million Chinese citizens working abroad today in difficult areas, in difficult territories, in difficult regions and countries where the security is not great. How are they going to protect their assets, the infrastructure that they're building, some of them that are basically Chinese? I mean, these are kind of basic questions that are behind this report. And our approach was trying to figure out how the Chinese security, military, and strategic community is thinking about that. Maybe some of the things that we're going to see in the future are not there yet, and yet the problems and the security challenges are already existing. So we wanted to have really authors who are experts in their domain, but also who can dig into Chinese sources so that we can see the Chinese approach before we can, describe what's going on. And I think that's a very important thing that we wanted to do. Not just wait or look from the outside, what's the shape of this military or security engagement, but also looking from the source of how the strategic thinkers back in Beijing think about those challenges and what options they see for the future. So the Chinese Ministry of Defense obviously denies that Belt and Road is a military endeavor or has any military intent. The reality is that Beijing's interests abroad are growing, and that there is a sense from the Chinese strategic community that we need protection. And as these interests expand, how is this community going to address the challenges that are in the event of a contingency or a crisis in those Belt and Road countries? So in thinking about this, China faces major constraints. Some of them are related to the image management, because Beijing is really trying to mitigate the impression that its actions are aggressive and militaristic and expansionist. So how do you reconcile the peaceful rise or peaceful development image that you want to give to the world with a necessity to expand militarily or on the security realm? So trying to assuage that image management or image suspicion from the outside world, complicated. Another constraint is really in the normative and legal area, and Mathieu is going to talk more about that. The non-interference principle, and how does that affect China's choices and options? If you're not supposed to interfere with domestic, affairs, and then you want to send your expeditionary forces to cope with a contingency, how do you reconcile this with your own, domestic constraints? So that's a key question as well. And Mathieu, I think, will say that it's a flexible process, maybe. And the third, of course, is the capacity gap. You might want to do things that your capacities don't allow you to do so far. And so how do you plan? What choices are you going to make to face the potential of future contingencies? And I think that Kristen will say a bit more about that too. So really, I want to say that the chapters here are sort of a snapshot, right? Because this is not a definitive answer. I think that the security, military, and strategic community in Beijing is really looking hard in those issues. We took a snapshot at what they're thinking now, and what we saw is that there are there are a wide array of possibilities that they're thinking about. Some are very traditionally military-oriented. Others are more, I would say, innovative or indirect approaches. And we really need to carefully look at them because they have different implications for how do we also respond to those areas. So there are 7 chapters, as have been mentioned before. I won't go into all of them. We can talk about them in the Q&A. But really, some of them are focusing more on the this kind of hard power military engagement. Others are looking at this innovative framework for military cooperation, and others, including private security companies. So this is, I think, is very, very interesting to see the array of options. What I want to underline here, though, is this is a tribute of how NBR works. We are a small think tank, but we can rely on a global network of experts. And this is really what you see here. We have 7 authors who come from France, the US. We have an Italian based in China. We have a Chinese author. We have a British author. We have an Australian author. All of them are experts in their domain, and all of them have contributed to this report. And I really want to thank each and all of them for the quality of the work they have done. This would not be possible without them. So with that, I'm going to end here. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. All right, we'll go right into Mathieu's remarks.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very honored to have been part of this publication and to have been invited to join this panel discussion today. As Nadege explained, I've contributed to this report by trying to look at what the Chinese say in the open source material regarding the possibility of having an overseas military operation to secure Chinese interest in Belt and Road countries. That was the assignment. And the more precise assignment was to look at the constraints rather than the incentives. My starting point would be that I think that the Belt and Road Initiative has accelerated a trend that was pre-existing, and that is the gradual importance of the protection of Chinese nationals overseas on the political agenda in Beijing. And I think that the key moment was 2004, the shock of having Chinese nationals being killed in terrorist attacks in Sudan, in Afghanistan, and in Pakistan. 3 attacks that were not linked, and that really changed the narrative and the thinking in Beijing regarding this issue. But that being said, the Belt and Road Initiative changes the way China thinks about these issues. And in my short presentation today, I want to look more precisely at 2 separate but connected issues. Number one, the possibility that China will build additional overseas bases to secure its interests in Belt and Road countries. And number 2, the key question for this discussion today, the possibility of having overseas military operations to secure Chinese interest in Belt and Road countries, and what kind of scenarios are we looking at? I think that the answer to these 2 questions is that all the cards are in the hands of Beijing now. I mean, all the options are on the table, having more bases, having military operations, and this was not the case 5 years ago. So the thinking has really changed, and I think it's the result mainly of the change of leadership thinking and the impact of Xi Jinping on the change of scale of China's national security policy from a very regional perspective centered on East Asian sovereignty issues to a global scale. And that's the story of the Belt and Road Initiative. So let me start with the question of overseas bases. I think that Djibouti is a very, very specific model. What makes Djibouti so special is that there are other countries that have naval bases or other sorts of military bases in Djibouti, and that's the reason why Djibouti was chosen by China. China could have made a different choice. It could have chosen, for example, to go in Oman, and China would have been alone in Oman, but it chose Djibouti, and it has now troops alongside military forces from the US, France, Japan, other European countries. And that tells you something about how China has proceeded regarding building overseas bases. I think that when you look at the narrative behind Djibouti, what the Chinese say is that there are three main missions linked to the Djibouti naval facility. Number one, providing logistical support to the anti-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden. That's very true. That's what Djibouti is about. Number two, providing support or providing a pivot for deployment of peacekeeping troops in Africa or in the region. That has not been the case yet, but you can think that this is likely that Djibouti will be used that way in the future. And number three, providing some logistical support for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions. This has been the case already when China dispatched the Peace Hawk hospital ship to Djibouti and to other countries on the eastern African coast 2 years ago. So this is very much a legitimate narrative for having picked Djibouti. What is interesting is that it's not only about these three missions, and we all see the connection, and it's very much also in the Chinese narrative between Djibouti and the potential threats against Chinese overseas nationals in the region, the possibility that terror attacks could target Chinese nationals in the region, that China would have to conduct non-combatant evacuation operations. This has been the case in 2015 for the first evacuation operation fully conducted by the Chinese Navy from Yemen through Djibouti. So the legitimacy discourse is extremely important. But this is about more than simply humanitarian assistance, peacekeeping, and UN-sanctioned anti-piracy missions. So you see the narrative and how it has shaped in Djibouti. What does it mean for future decisions that China can take? There's a lot of debate in the US, in the world, regarding where will China next base be built. And there's a lot of rumors regarding many ports, Sihanoukville, the Maldives, Vanuatu, even sometimes the Mediterranean, with never compelling evidence, especially if you work with open source material on these things. I think that if China follow the Djibouti model, what will be needed for China to build its next facility is one, a crisis, and two, a narrative that can convince the international community. If tomorrow China decided to build a base, a naval base, in Gwadar or in Jiwani in Pakistan without any crisis with Iran in the Strait of Hormuz, that would be extremely offensive. That would mean a change of China's strategic software. That would mean an aggressive policy towards India, towards the United States. It would mean that the logic behind China's overseas military operations would completely change. But then, if you look again at Jiwani and Gwadar as, maybe where the Chinese next overseas naval base will be built, I think that if there is an opening in the form, or an opportunity in the form of a multinational escort mission in the Strait of Hormuz, then you would have a sufficient narrative for China to build an additional facility in that place. So that's one starting point I want to make regarding overseas bases. In the paper, I touch upon the Chinese facility in Tajikistan because I think it's very important, and I think it's interesting to contrast the Chinese facility in Tajikistan with the Chinese facility in Djibouti. One of the main differences, and it's quite obvious, is that China communicates a lot about Djibouti, but does not communicate at all about Tajikistan, apart from not really denying that it's there, that there's a small facility to oversee security in the Wakhan corridor, the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan, and Tajikistan and China. But it shows that Djibouti is really a starting point, and the mindset has completely changed in Beijing regarding overseas facilities. My second point is on the possibility of having overseas military operations, using these overseas bases or not. On that point, I observe that the strategic discussion has completely changed in China. If you do research interviews, or if you speak with the PLA about this, I think that 5 years ago the answer would be non-interference. Today the answer is, they don't really know. It's an option. It's clear. I think the software has changed, and I think that one of the main driver for this change has been terrorist risks and the counter-terrorism outlook that China has, and the terror attacks that Chinese nationals have suffered in many countries in the world over the past 10 years. It's just a fact. It's just a fact, and that's where we go to the legal dimension. The 2015 counter-terror law passed by the National People's Congress has been a watershed in this discussion. I think once things change at that level, then the strategic discussion completely changes, because you see, and this is part of what is now translated in English as rules-based governance, not rule of law, but rules-based governance. That is part of the software changed under Xi Jinping. I think that the People's Armed Police Force has really lobbied. You have the Navy, but you also do have the PAP, and the PAP, and it's deployed, in fact, in overseas missions, for example, to protect Chinese embassies in Afghanistan and in Iraq, has almost a vested interest to grow outside China's borders, and is seeing the terrorist risk and counter-terror missions as really the driver of a global expansion. And it's very much present in the sources. I have, for this report, translated a few pieces published by PAP officers in some Chinese military journals. I mean, you can see that there is an intention by the PAP to be present globally to support Chinese interest and defend Chinese nationals overseas. So what kind of scenarios, now that the thinking on bases has changed and the thinking on overseas military missions has changed as well? I mean, if you think in terms of gradation, I would say, number one, a non-combatant evacuation operation in conditions that are more complex than conditions that China faced in Kyrgyzstan, in Yemen, in Libya. That is almost, automatic. That's going to be the Chinese response to a major crisis involving Chinese nationals overseas. There will be an evacuation. And then it depends on the circumstances, the conditions, the risks, etc. One level up, I would say, an evacuation of diplomatic staff from an embassy. And in the material I translated, there's a very interesting paragraph from, I think, a PAP officer saying that one of their nightmare scenario is the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Turkey. An attack against diplomatic staff, and how the PAP or Chinese military would have to respond to this. If there was, for example, kidnapping of Chinese diplomatic staff, that's the sort of scenarios for which the PAP is training, and this would mean a difficult extraction. So that's a scenario for the future. Then one level up, I would say, terrorist attack against one Chinese project in one Belt and Road country. In fact, it doesn't matter that much if it's a Belt and Road country or not, I would say. But this would invite some sort of response. Some of you may have seen the movie Red Sea, Red Sea Operation, which is quite interesting because it was actually sponsored by the PLA Navy, the political arm of the PLA Navy. So a lot of people have watched the movie Lone Wolf too, but this one I think is more interesting because it's part of the internal and domestic and international communication of the PLA Navy. That sort of scenario is now very much a possibility. And then on the scale, if you move one level up, I think there's the question of, and it's in the sources, the response to a terrorist attack by targeting specific individuals or specific groups, in fact moving in the direction of an American model in response to terrorist attacks. I think that the discussion is very much going in that direction. So to conclude very quickly, 2 points. Number one, I think that now that the thinking has completely changed, what will decide future scenarios, what will be decisive is really events, crisis, how China will pragmatically respond to specific crisis scenarios. And number two, and I'm speaking more from a European perspective here, I don't think that everyone has adjusted their thinking to the fact that China is really moving in the direction of being an interventionist state. I think that the software remains strategic caution, but there are now many, many possibilities that China will exit strategic caution as a result of specific crisis.
Wonderful, great. And Kristen?
Last but not least.
No, definitely not least.
I just wanted to thank Nadege and Roy for having me on the panel and as part of the project. It's been a really great experience. So a lot of what I did actually dovetails very nicely with Mathieu's presentation. So the PLA is developing the capabilities for some of those scenarios that you've been talking about. I looked specifically at Pla Expeditionary Capabilities, so how the PLA is responding to increased pressure by Beijing to protect its citizens and interests abroad. And also I looked at where and when Beijing might choose to deploy its forces overseas in the future, which is kind of the question on everyone's mind. So I'm going to also echo something that Mathieu said, in that the trend towards China focusing on its expeditionary capabilities has been there for some time. The BRI increased the urgency of that, I would say. But the drivers have been there for a while, and those include things like the China Dream, national rejuvenation, where Xi Jinping calls for an increase in China's political, economic, and military power. It calls for a strong military. Another one would be China's expanding involvement in international affairs. You can see this in increased funding for UN peacekeeping operations in places like Sudan, where more and more peacekeepers are going, Chinese peacekeepers, to protect the oil fields there. A third one that people don't always talk about, but it's important, is increased domestic pressure in China on the leadership to protect citizens abroad, especially when they come into harm's way. That's where you saw some of the non-combatant evacuation operations and things like that. And then a final driver is on pressure on China to become an international security provider as it becomes more strong militarily in things like, it's been criticized in the past for not intervening in places like, even in its own region, like after Typhoon Haiyan, not having the HADR capabilities that the U.S. does and being shown up by the U.S. So these are drivers that have been around for some time, I would say over a decade now. And but the BRI has really increased the urgency for the PLA to develop the capabilities to close some of these gaps. So which threats does the PLA assess it as most likely to face overseas? Because this really drives into how they're structuring their expeditionary force. The Chinese discussed the threats in 4 areas, basically. The first is maritime security, so protection of overseas ports like Djibouti and bases. SLOCs, maritime trade routes, and then humanitarian assistance, disaster relief type capabilities. A second threat is border security and counterterrorism, and this is becoming increasingly a concern, particularly for Chinese analysts point out along the border with Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, but also places like India and North Korea. And the PLA is already deployed to some of these places, as has the PAP, but there's also been PLA troops in some of these places. A third threat area is local or regional unrest or conflict. This is Chinese citizens are being sent to BRI countries. And some of them are quite unstable. We saw this with Uganda in 2018, where there was widespread unrest, and Chinese businessmen were threatened. And in that case, the Ugandan local military was called on to protect the Chinese citizens. But you could envision a scenario in which more widespread unrest might require either PAP or PLA boots on the ground at some point. And then a final threat is threats to infrastructure and investments, so things like factories, power plants, pipelines, roadways, and railways. And these are, at the moment, mostly being protected by private security forces or local security forces. So less in the PLA bin, but still being thought about. So what capabilities is the PLA focused on improving? What are the capabilities and the gaps and the trends? And I'm going to just kind of cherry pick some of them because I don't want to put you all to sleep. But so the first point to understand is that the PLA is developing its expeditionary capabilities across all domains. That means sea, air, land, and space. They're developing capabilities in all of these domains to deploy forces overseas. But some domains are more developed than others. For example, their expeditionary sea power is the most developed. And that's in line with the PLA's general emphasis on maritime operations and distant seas, which they've been focused on for some time now. And these types of capabilities include surface combatants, amphibious warfare ships, the aircraft carriers, and the hospital ship. This is all going to be supported by expeditionary air power. So this is still limited. The PLA Air Force is under the gun now to provide more strategic airlift capability, which has hampered Chinese expeditionary operations in the past. And so that's kind of what they're focused on in that respect. But it's looked at as supporting maritime operations. For the land power, the ground forces, the PLA's never needed to sustain significant forces overseas. I think it's pretty unlikely that they'll send a large contingent of ground forces overseas anytime in the near future. But they do have pockets of capability, and those are largely in special forces, also the peacekeeping and the border patrol forces. So they're improving the capabilities in all of those areas, and special forces would be useful in a kidnapping scenario, for example, or a hostage scenario. And some of the special forces have actually already deployed in the Gulf of Aden with the counter-piracy task forces, so they're getting some experience. And then finally, there's space capabilities, and so you need the space capabilities to enable military operations abroad, and that includes satellite navigation, communication, meteorology for real-time data and intelligence support. And China's developing capabilities in all of these areas, including on-the-ground support facilities for these areas too. That said, they do face some significant challenges. Some have already been discussed a little bit by Mr. Sbragia, mentioned the command, control, and coordination issues. So who controls what forces overseas? They have a new theater command structure, and it probably depends on the contingency, but you could envision if something were to happen in Pakistan, for example, the Western Theater Command might control those forces there. But if something happens in the maritime domain, that's we're not sure who controls that. And so I think there's some. I'm not sure the PLA entirely knows that either at the moment. So we'll have to wait and see with that issue. Logistics is still an issue for them. They're mitigating the inadequate sea lift, airlift, and at-sea replenishment issues. They've been producing large amounts of ships and planes to mitigate those things, but they still need more places. And so, while I agree they'll be very careful about establishing another base, they are actively looking to have dual-use access agreements at many ports around the world because they need places to pre-position equipment and for logistics. The third challenge is lack of experience and training. And so a very, very small percentage of the PLA is actually deployed abroad, and most of those have been in peacekeeping or in counter-piracy operations, and it's a very small percentage. So they really don't have a lot of experience abroad. They don't have a lot of experience in crises. And they've tried to mitigate this by doing more realistic training. You can read a lot in the literature about their distant seas training, for example, in the maritime realm, where they go out and they have groups and they train. But they haven't been crisis tested, and so I think the NEOs were limited in nature. They were small, so it's a little bit unclear how well they will do in a wider or broader crisis. And then finally, there's the challenge of the other countries' reactions to a global PLA. They are encountering some wariness about BRI in general. Having a broader military footprint, which they're looking to do, is also probably going to create some tension and backlash. And so that's a challenge in terms of how they deal with host country reactions and other reactions around the world. So in terms of answering the question of when the PLA when Beijing might choose to deploy the PLA, it's likely a combination of when the drivers I first mentioned, the public expectations or protection of investments or direct threats to Chinese interests, when a combination of those meet with, they have the expeditionary capabilities that are sufficient enough to do the mission. So it's the nexus of those two things. And those are likely to be found in the maritime area where the capabilities are the most developed and they've already had some experience. And also in the border counterterrorism areas where they're taking the threat of terrorism pretty seriously, and there's increased concern over some of the borders. And this would all be supported by the limited air power, strategic airlift, and airborne capability that I talked about earlier. In terms of where they might deploy, you'd likely see more deployment for maritime missions, so protection of ports and facilities, just like Djibouti, but also potentially Pakistan and other places where they have dual-use access agreements. You'll see more SLOC and trade route protection. For example, China has expressed interest in possibly patrolling the Persian Gulf, which would represent a pretty significant step up from the Gulf of Aden counter-piracy patrols that it does now, and maybe in the Indian Ocean as well. Humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, more in Southeast Asia, likely more in the Indian Ocean, and also non-combatant evacuation operations, depends on the crisis and what they would do, but likely more of those. In terms of border and counterterrorism missions, we'll likely see increased presence in Afghanistan, either by the PAP or the PLA, Pakistan and Central Asia, and Tajikistan, obviously, where they have the facility. And that includes more joint patrols and partnerships with other countries. So also training, they're also training other countries, border patrol forces, for example, on how to protect the border so that they don't have to put as many resources into it themselves. So those are the areas where I think they we'll see more PLA deployment, and where they're likely to focus on in the at least the near future. I guess looking further out, you'd have the question of more bases and more complex maritime operations. I think I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you all so much for those wonderful presentations. And I definitely noticed, as you kind of identified in the beginning of your remarks, Kristen, a trend between the two presentations that I think is also echoed in pieces of the other analysis in the report, which is that this is not necessarily a series of trends that are brand new, that are only derived from Xi Jinping's leadership. There are aspects of all parts of this that kind of were underway for some time, but that certainly there's an acceleration. There has been some shift and certainly some changes that you've identified, in your analysis. And so I think those are some interesting threads for us to pull on. In the introduction of the report, there's a note about how in the 2015 Defense White Paper, there was kind of an unprecedented emphasis on securing China's maritime interests and the PLA's role as one of its core missions to doing so. And we saw this year that we got a new white paper. So the 2019 white paper released in the summer kind of built on some of those same trends. And I'd be curious to hear from each one of you. I don't know how much opportunity you had to kind of tease out aspects of that in your analysis as this was kind of being published, I think, right after that was released. But are there things that you saw in the new 2019 white paper that kind of reflect this acceleration and change in the trends that were existing already in 2015? So kind of comparing those two. And what did you see that's new and different, I guess?
Well, I haven't read the new white paper, so I'm sorry. But I'll let Mathieu and Kristen respond if they want. I just want to go back to the research question about whether BRI is an inflection point in the defense planning of China, and I think the report also shows that not really.
Maybe not, yeah.
So that it's not like suddenly the PLA is going to completely change direction in their planning and the operations that they're thinking about. It's just that it gives maybe more focus and maybe more urgency in starting to think about this kind of deployments. But it's not it, and I think both Mathieu and Kristen just said it. It's an effort that's been going on for quite a while already, and I think there is no change of general direction. It just accelerates, it gives focus, and it gives emphasis on some areas, but there's no fundamental shift. It's not like suddenly the PLA is just going to focus on high intensity conflicts or how do we provide stabilization operations in other countries that they're not there, maybe not yet or not at all. So yeah, it's just that I think BRI also maybe gives a rationale or an additional rationale for that kind of power projection capabilities or expeditionary capabilities that the PLA would want anyway. So it's a mutually reinforcing, I think, what the PLA wants and what BRI can provide as a driver for that kind of modernization.
I think what really changes under Xi Jinping is that some debates that were taking place in China, and in particular the discussion regarding China being a global security actor or not. I mean, previously there was a lot of resistance against this idea, but there was also a line of thinking that was supporting the idea that China should become a global security player. I mean, suddenly with Xi Jinping, what you have is an end to this debate, and something decisive and conclusive, and the state that adjusts to this decisive conclusion. I think it's very obvious from a number of policy documents, and I have two in mind, not the most recent white paper, but the conclusion of one EU-China summit and the conclusion of one Africa-China summit, because these are two cases where China was extremely reluctant to portray itself as a global security player in the past. I mean, relations with Europe, relations with Africa, and suddenly during the first term of Xi, around 2014, 2015, you have an acknowledgement in the final communiques of this diplomatic summit that one, they agreed to see Europe they agreed to see security as a pillar of EU-China cooperation, even though it's not really happening in practice. I think the mindset has changed. And in Africa, they accept to admit that they have a role in African security affairs. I'll just say one thing regarding the 2019 Defense White Paper, because that's one new element which I noticed. I think that's the first time, and please someone correct me if I'm wrong, that the question of foreign naval presence in the South China Sea is included in the report. And that, I think, is an evolution. On our topic today, I think that this is just a continuity.
Yep. Yeah, I think another difference under Xi Jinping is this their definition of what is security, or their debate over what is security. Because I think before you could very clearly see a division between what they considered internal security and then the external security. And BRI has really brought internal and external security kind of together. I mean, now they have to worry about terrorist attacks on either Chinese interests, for example, or even on the borders. And the PAP is a good example. They've expanded the PAP. It used to just be purely focused on containing riots in China and other things like that. But now it's broadened out. The mission set is broadened out, and so I think that reflects a difference in thinking from the leadership in Beijing on security has to be looked at as more holistic. And so we'll probably see more changes. Actually, the anti-terrorism law is another really good example of that, where you take a domestic issue and broaden it out, enabling having a legal framework to send forces abroad. So,
Great. And I wanted to pick up on one more thing, and then I'll turn it over for Q&A. But just the point that Mathieu made at the end about adjusting, both in the United States and other Western countries, adjusting the thinking to kind of come to terms with the fact that China now can be seen as kind of an interventionist country. I'd be curious to hear all of your thoughts on what the themes and key points that you've identified in your analysis mean for the United States and for Western countries focusing on the region. What should we be focused most on, the United States, out of all these different changes and different aspects of China's securing its interests along the BRI? What is the role for the United States as we look at these, and for other Western countries?
And I think it clearly raises questions about engagement with the PLA. Djibouti raises questions about engagement. There are now interactions, and I'm not going to speak for the United States, but I think the discussion in Europe has slightly evolved on this matter, also as a result of, I would say, the governance style of Xi Jinping. There used to be the idea that China could become an important international security partner in the Middle East. This is not really happening in practice. You have some very limited engagement in the Gulf of Aden, rather limited joint exercises, in scope and in terms of the items that are being exercised by the two sides. And if you look at the policy documents on the European side, it used to be that more engagement was some sort of a policy goal, and now it's very much focused on maybe possibilities in dealing with crisis in Africa, but I don't think that there is a strong political push on either side to move ahead with the idea of more military engagement, or seeing the Chinese naval permanent presence in Djibouti as an opportunity. I don't think that's the dominant vision at all, especially in France, but in Europe in general. I think there are questions regarding the ultimate intentions of this change of scale of Chinese military presence. It doesn't mean that there will be no engagement or no cooperation in future crises. If you think in terms of an evacuation, for example, mean, it would be just needed for logistical reasons. I have a very good example that dates back to the Chinese evacuation from Kyrgyzstan, I think in 2010, which I studied before, because there was a simultaneous evacuation of European nationals from Kyrgyzstan. And at one point, when you evacuate nationals, you have to rely on the security provided by the local, by the national government in question. And it's either competition or cooperation. In the case of Kyrgyzstan in 2010, it was competition because the resources of the Kyrgyz government were limited. So, you know, it's who gets the escort first, and this has consequences. I think it takes some exchanges indeed with the PLA for that sort of scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, so as the PLA goes out into the world, you know, I think the U.S. and our allies and partners we're going to struggle a little bit with how to, you know, what do you do with that? So there are different ways to approach that. You know, one is you could just say, well, leave China to its own devices, in which case you risk China doing what it wants to do with sort of no input from anyone else. You end up with maybe a rogue actor type country. Or you could, you know, get together an international coalition to shape and try and you know, influence a little bit China's expeditionary force development and choices. And then there might be cases such as an evacuation where China might ask for help, for assistance if it can't get all of its citizens out, or if its expeditionary capabilities aren't developed enough. So I really think it depends on how we react and how our allies like Japan and Australia and others react to a PLA expeditionary force. Really depends on the situation, the crisis, and also what interests are at stake. That's not really a great answer, but I think that's that's what we have to do.
Anything else to add? No. Great. All right. So we'll open it up to questions. As before, please do introduce yourself before you ask, and please do keep it to a question, not a comment. So we'll go Teresa over here.
Thank you so much. Teresa Lowe, House Foreign Affairs Majority Staff. Thank you for your remarks today, and congratulations on your report. I look forward to reading it more thoroughly. Two quick questions. The first pertains to the actual substance of China's securitization of its projects and assets overseas. There are some other experts who look at the similar issue set and also talk about how China might increasingly look to, you know, bilateral arms sales or the utilization of UN peacekeepers or, you know, increased mil training to help increasingly securitize Chinese investments overseas. To what extent does your research also touch upon that? And if so, are there sort of telltale signs of where might China think about deploying which tool? How should people be looking at the space think about that? And the second piece is a more broader sort of retroactively. In your research, what are some areas where you think, you know, having done this analysis, do you think people in DC, for example, or in this general community is overhyping some of the threats? Like where areas where we are overblowing some of the concerns? And conversely, where are some areas where we're not paying enough attention?
Great. All right. So the first question, I think, Nadege, would you like to take?
Okay,
a stab?
sure. Thank you very much for your questions. We do address the first question. That's part of what I called innovative approach or indirect approach earlier. It's not just about military deployments. This is obviously part of it, but also what kind of other tools that China may have or may think about so that they don't have to deal with the problem directly, because this can be a bit messy. So yes, military cooperation, military sales, training, equipment can be part of, all of those are also part of how they're thinking about making sure that they sort of how do you say, contractualize? How do you say that? Yeah, the security of their at least assets for now. So basically, we have a very interesting example in Pakistan where you have 15,000 local soldiers who are devoted to the security of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Who is paying for them, I'm not sure. But this is basically delocalization of the responsibility for your protection to a local actor. In the report, we have a couple of case studies, including Central Asia. In particular, Raffaello Pantucci looked at how does the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, can provide a framework for joint, exercises, counterterrorism exercises that can also act as ways for China to transfer know-how or training practices and so on and so forth. So I think also what we might want to think of is not necessarily the military to military, but also the internal security to internal security relationship. Because again, when you're facing terrorism groups or terrorist groups or dissident groups or activists or anything, in the end, it might be the local forces, police or domestic security forces that are going to have to act on the ground. And so I think we really need to be more aware of what's going on at that level also. Again, the transfer of know-how, transfer of practice, of surveillance technologies and so on and so forth that can be used in preventing even such problems to happen.
And anything to add on overhyping, understudying issues here in DC?
I can maybe say a little bit about that. And I think Mr. Sbragia said in his remarks, China is not going to mirror what the US is doing. They're going to do it their own way with their own strengths and their own weaknesses. And so I think this is part of, our own mirror imaging. We're doing it this way, so China is going to do it this way. Well, not necessarily. And because we see that, yes, Belt and Road is really kind of pushing China's outreach out there in places that it's never been present before, we're thinking, well, they're going to have, I don't know, 20 aircraft carriers, and well, maybe not, and this is exactly what we were trying to show here, that there are many different ways you can think about those challenges, and some of these options have to be taken seriously, but it's not necessarily the case that every investment in port is going to become a PLA Navy base in the future. It might be, as Julia Xue says in her paper, we're considering that dual use, and by the way, maybe not just PLA Navy, but COSCO might help us in supplying, resource for our logistics and so on and so forth. I mean, this is quite creative and innovative. So, I agree that we need to put the PLA under scrutiny, but let's base our assessment on facts as much as we can. This is what we have tried to do. And the problem is also that many of the things that could happen have not happened yet. We're talking about operations or contingencies that haven't happened yet, but may well come up very soon, maybe sooner than we think. And then the PLA will also have to adapt very quickly, and maybe they're going to respond in a way that we didn't anticipate. So be vigilant, but also try not to be too mirror imaging what the US is doing, because probably China is not going to be able to do it the same way.
So I just want to say the reason I put the challenges the PLA is facing with its expeditionary force in my chapter is because it really does face some pretty significant challenges. And even though it can do some of these operations in limited scope, it's really still under development for anything broader. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the PLA for sure, but I think we can be realistic about, and they're fairly realistic, I think too, about what they can actually do. So, it's when you project out 30, 40 years
Yeah.
that you get into, you know, what are they going to look like then? But that's, you know, anyway, I'm just saying that there are some significant gaps they have to mitigate first.
Yep. All right. Let's go here.
Hi, Emily Weinstein, Point Bello. I was wondering if you guys could touch on, and I know Nadege briefly mentioned Costco, the role of Chinese state-owned enterprises in mobilization abroad and the potential for militarization of BRI commercial assets.
The only example that came up in this particular report, and I haven't done much research on other things, is in Julia's chapter on dual-use port facilities, where she mentions Costco as one of the SOEs that Beijing might want to use just to, you know, for basic logistic support. So I don't know if this is going to be a pattern that we're going to see elsewhere, but I thought that her description of that was very interesting, because this is something that I didn't think was so far advanced in their own thinking. So, and yeah, question mark. Sorry, Emily, I can't remember. But yeah, something to follow too, because you can see how this, you know, Belt and Road is really deployed mostly through those state-owned enterprises. But then just the fact that it's mentioned there as a possibility for the state to use, to support some of those military operations is kind of an interesting insight.
So I saw one back here.
Thank you. Libo Liu, VOA. Two questions, please. First of all, BRI countries have been maintaining a delicate balance between China and the U.S. and China, allowing China to be more involved in economic development and more receptive to China economically, and then meanwhile more receptive to U.S. militarily. Have you, in your study, seen any trend that these countries, more and more countries, are receptive to China in both economic terms and also militarily? In other words, allowing China to provide a security assurance in a greater extent than before. Second question is, there's talk about China lacks expertise and experience in going overseas. I'm wondering if you, in your study, if you found any U.S. private companies providing assistance to China in that effort. Thank you.
Sorry, what was the first question?
Along the BRI countries.
Both military and economic. Okay,
yes,
sorry.
Yep.
I know Nadezhda knows about the second part, right? Anyway,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there are a few countries that that are maybe more receptive to both military and economic advancements by the Chinese, and you know, so a country like Pakistan, for example, I think it's countries where the investments are significant. The BRI investments are significant, so like CPEC, and where they're already sort of friendly towards China, so they might be willing to accept a dual-use port access, or maybe even a port or a base eventually, or a port that where China could place some troops there. And I think, though, if they did that, it's obviously very sensitive, and you'd probably start with a very small footprint. So, a small contingent of Marines, for example, like they did in Djibouti, and call it a logistics hub, and then build from there. And so I think that's the kind of thing we would see, probably not some large facility somewhere where they all of a sudden move thousands of troops in.
I will add two things to that. Where I see a sustained Chinese effort to spill over from the economic sphere to the military cooperation sphere is really in Southeast Asia, and I think it's happening through arms sales and military diplomacy. I'm thinking of Malaysia and Thailand and Cambodia, which I think are three countries worth looking at for your question. And I think that where China has really completely changed its attitude regarding security is really in Afghanistan. If you compare Chinese policy towards Afghanistan to China's policy towards the conflict in Syria, I think the contrast is extremely stark. Even though China has also a deep security interest in the outcome of the war in Syria, I think China has been very much focused on only focusing on access to intelligence and that sort of things, and been very much cautious about refraining from any involvement in Syria beyond that part, beyond that question of access to intelligence. But in Afghanistan, because of the possibility of a power vacuum, you see a much more active Chinese policy. And I'm struck personally because I did a study of China's policy towards Afghanistan and Pakistan in 2008, 2009. And during the debate here on AFPAC policy and how to engage China, how the US could engage China as a partner in Afghanistan to help with the outcome of the conflict. And China's response at the time was extremely reluctant. And I still remember translating an article on the Wakhan corridor. And the substance of the article was the Wakhan corridor is completely useless. We can't even think of the possibility that terrorists, or like individuals, or not even speaking of groups, could cross the Chinese border through the Wakhan corridor because it's covered in snow for the largest part of the year, etc. And you fast forward to 2019, and you see that the debate has completely changed. And it's the presence in Tajikistan is only part of this. The presence, the Chinese military presence in the Wakhan corridor is really a huge change by that standard, observing China's Afghan policy during this past decade. And of course, what really matters is the diplomatic efforts, the Chinese involvement in mediation. So you see a lot of moves happening at the same time. Also the creation of this quadrilateral coordination mechanism, which I think is really worth attention because it's the first time the PLA is at the origin of the creation of a multilateral cooperation mechanism. And it's about border security, it's about Xinjiang, but it means a completely renewed approach to security in Afghanistan.
So the Wakhan corridor, it's nothing to do with climate change and less snow over there. No. It's another driver. But that also tells you, I remember the study that Mathieu wrote 10 years ago. It also tells you that things change and the threat perception changes and the material capabilities change. And so what we're, again, this is our effort to kind of describe what's going on now, but maybe in 10 years hopefully when you still sit here and trying to make sense of what China is doing, we might come with different conclusions because the capabilities would be greater and the threat perception will be different as well. So, what was the other question about experts? I can't remember.
U.S. security, private companies, private contractors.
So there is one private security contractor that's called Frontier Group. It's Eric Prince's private security company that is providing training to some private security companies in China to secure, and specifically to secure Belt and Road. One, I think it's based in Xinjiang. There's a training camp in Xinjiang, or at least there was one in the news a couple of years ago. I don't know where it stands now. And another one, I believe, in Yunnan. So one more dedicated to the continental Silk Road and the other one more to the maritime one. So private security companies, and this is also one of the chapters that we have studied in this report, in China there's a multitude of private security actors that are mostly, used to mostly operate at the local level in China. And now they're starting to see that there's a possibility for them to play a role globally, but there's still a long way to go. They're constrained by China's law. They can't, officially they can't carry guns in China, and therefore not abroad either, if my understanding is correct. I think here I think it might be more a liability than an asset, because they're not really trained to operate in very complex, security environments yet. And right now, they're mostly used to basically secure construction projects, so like security guards, but not deployed as mercenaries in very complex areas or unstable areas. So this is really something that is in development, and we need to try to get a better understanding at what they're doing. And Alesso Arduino, is it Arduino? Yeah, Arduino is doing a great job in trying to provide again a description of who these actors are and what they're doing. So.
Right, back here. Right behind you there.
Hi. My name is Derek Solon. I'm with the China Aerospace Studies Institute. I was just wondering if, in hindsight, in your research, you noticed any indications that, say, the base in Djibouti, that would be built. I mean, one thing that we're always looking for when we're trying to predict where a base is going to be built is any indication other than rumors. So I'm wondering if you saw anything in like the pattern of diplomatic exchanges or anything that would indicate that base would be built.
Well, so I mean, just looking back over my own research from the last 10 plus years, initially the debate in Beijing was really about, we're not going to do bases, we're just going to do places, and then the counter-piracy operations happened, and they had places to do certain things with. But then I think, the discussion fundamentally changed again when they realized that they had to have an expeditionary military capability that was broader than just counter-piracy operations, particularly in the maritime realm. And so, I don't know about diplomatic exchanges per se, but definitely the tenor of the conversation changed along with their maritime strategy, which has changed. And so the blending of the near seas and far seas and all of that has allowed them to have a reason to have a base, for example. And so, yeah, I don't know if you have particular specifics on that, but
specifics difficult on this. But no, I think that if the current trends follow their natural course, this will be highly political. I think this will need to be framed as, a cooperation. Security cooperation with one state in particular, with the idea that this is about the common good. I think that this emphasis on legitimacy will be extremely important. So I would say, rather anti-piracy in the Gulf of Guinea than Vanuatu. Then there's also the possibility that trends change, and then China takes a more aggressive approach regarding building bases overseas. I don't really see it coming, but it depends very much, in my opinion, on the evolution of the US-China relationship.
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on the political aspect a little bit more, the Chinese have gotten a lot more savvy about, I think, how to, set up shop somewhere. So when the base in Djibouti was initially built, the local they did no outreach to the local population, and there was some backlash over it, as there are in many BRI countries. The Chinese come in and they build stuff, and nobody benefits. And so I think they've gotten more they're not great at it, but they've gotten savvier about reaching out to the local population, doing more propaganda type stuff to show that there are benefits to Chinese presence, and also working more with the local leaders and the local government. And these are all things that they discuss a little bit in some of their writings.
Yeah, I think that part about image management is really important, and trying to have people get used to a more important presence, maybe through peacekeeping operations, and that I think that legitimacy for China having a base there is critical. Yeah.
All right, we have time for one more question. I have 3 hands up. So we'll go right here. If we have a few more minutes, we can try to take a few more, but let's see.
Caleb Debendal with CrowdStrike Intelligence. With the announcement of Chinese companies like Venus Tech and TopSec that have known ties to Chinese patriotic hackers, or in some cases, MSS cyber contractors, the announcement of companies like these as being providers of network security along the digital Silk Road, I wonder if anyone on the panel has seen evidence of what exactly this means, this provision of network security. And would you potentially characterize it as you have with some of the military expansion along the BRI, that being that the BRI is both serving as requiring an increased need for security legitimately to secure assets, but also perhaps as justification to expand some capabilities worldwide?
I'm not familiar with the hacker question. Mike Chase has a chapter on digital Silk Road and how does that actually help improving C4ISR capabilities. That nexus, kind of out there with the hackers, I wasn't studied or examined in this one. But definitely, digital Silk Road with both the communication component and satellite component of it is critical to improving those C4ISR capacities. And then yes, the other question is, we're wrestling with that. Yeah, exactly. So is that? But I think the answer is that the truth is in between. There's an actual need. BRI has, it just fits perfectly well with what the PLA would want to do. It's kind of the vision for global expansion, but what form exactly is it going to take? That's what we're trying to wrestle with. And the jury is not completely out, even in Beijing, I think, still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I just think there's, beyond sort of the strategic intent, there's also a question of coordination and how well China could coordinate the various entities. We were talking about this earlier. And, there's a question about as BRI expands and as they have more interests, in more places, how do you coordinate all of that in a way that makes it strategic in nature versus just opportunistic? And I think China is fairly opportunistic. But tying that all together into a strategy, I think they probably have some of that, but it's probably the answer to that is probably in between all those things right now.
I agree with that. I will add one more thing related. I think where I detect kind of a sense of weakness in Chinese publications or in interactions with Chinese experts on these issues is on the question of understanding the situation country by country, access to intelligence. I think the world is really intelligence, and building the capacity to really have a clear picture about what's going on in BRI country or throughout the world. So I think there is a very strong awareness in China that this is one of the centers of China's efforts in the coming years. I think it's very strong in the Chinese narrative today.
Great. Well, I think we will go ahead and stop there, but if you have any other questions, you're welcome to come talk to our panelists afterward. Would encourage you to come up and exchange information. And then let's just give another round of applause and thanks to our presenters. So when do you said you started?
I'm not starting until April because I've got.
So it'll be a full week. I was going to ask, is this in your own projects, not
Of course. Thank you so much for having us, and congratulations on the report. It's really a huge fan of your work. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Super informative. Yeah, so I just wanted to also yeah, absolutely.
Border security is really the driving force. I don't see China as a power that is keeping us despite
Thank you so much. Oh, great. No problem. We can share. Thank you so much again.
I'll see you later again. Nice to see you again. I have the name from here to put up over there. It's very, very good. And when you speak, I'll just the essential. Well, see you later. Yeah, good.
Please send me some of your
Slide it or is there a lock?
You have to like unhook it from here first. You may not look so easy. It'd be really just putting it up.
So we have one of these for one of the a research conference that I ran on campus, and I found out the hard way that if you pull it too hard, it like shoots out. And then I had to spend like 30 minutes before our conference, like trying to like slide it back in. Not easy.
my civilian capacity, it's good. Take care.
Most of our stuff is